Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling this question that I think has been around for centuries.
hmm
How do the stories we consume shape who we are as people?
yeah, big question.
Yeah. And we have an incredible source to kind of unpack all of this, a section from Plato's Republic.
Okay.
And specifically, this is a dialogue where Socrates, who's the main character, really digs into the power of poetry and imitation.
Very cool.
Yeah.
It is fascinating because most people, when they think about the Republic, they think about this exploration of justice and building this like perfect society, this utopia.
Right.
But what we're looking at today goes even deeper. It's about how those stories that we tell, and even the very act of imitating those stories, actually molds us as individuals and even as a collective.
It's ancient Greece, right? So when we say poetry, we're talking about epics like Homer's Iliad,
hmm
big sweeping tales of, heroes and gods.
Exactly. And Socrates uses the Iliad as kind of a prime example because Homer, who wrote it, does something really clever. Sometimes he narrates his events directly to the reader, but then he'll switch and he'll speak in character as if he were one of the people in the story.
Okay. That's interesting. So why does Socrates even care about this difference in storytelling styles? Like, what's the big deal?
Well, that's where I think it gets really thought-provoking. Socrates is concerned about something he calls imitation, the act of copying or mimicking someone else. And he argues that when we imitate, we actually take on a bit of that person's character, whether it's their words or their actions or even their way of thinking.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that if I spend all my time watching movies about superheroes, I might start acting a little more heroic myself.
Yeah.
Or if I binge watch, like reality TV full of all this drama, I might actually start getting drawn into those types of conflicts in my own life.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. And Socrates' real worry is what happens when we imitate negative or unworthy characters. He believes we risk becoming a bit like them, even if we don't consciously realize it's happening.
Now that you mention it, it does kind of make sense. I mean, we all have these role models, whether they're celebrities or fictional characters or even people in our own lives. And it's hard to imagine that those role models don't rub off on us in some way.
Right, yeah. And for Socrates, this has, huge implications, especially when he starts applying it to his vision of an ideal society.
Okay, so let's talk about that ideal society. So in the Republic, Socrates really lays out this whole plan for how to create this perfect city. And a big part of that plan is the role of the guardians. Can you remind us who are these guardians and why are they so important?
Absolutely. The Guardians are basically the elite class, the leaders and protectors of Socrates' ideal city. They're the ones who make all the important decisions and, they have the most power.
So given how seriously Socrates takes this whole imitation thing, it sounds like he has some very specific ideas about what these guardians should and should not be imitating.
He does. He believes that to create the ideal society, you need ideal citizens leading the way. And for him, that starts with the Guardians only imitating noble and virtuous characters the best of the best. So those qualities actually become ingrained in them.
So are we talking like ancient Greek heroes like Achilles or maybe philosophers like Socrates himself?
Well, those are good guesses, but it's actually even more specific. Socrates has a whole list of things that Guardians should avoid imitating. For example, he thinks they shouldn't imitate women who are overly emotional or argumentative. He also says they shouldn't imitate slaves because he sees their behavior as submissive and, not fitting for leaders.
Wow, so those are some pretty strict rules.
Yeah.
It sounds like Socrates is really trying to control every aspect of the guardians' lives, even down to the stories they hear and the people they interact with.
He is, and it doesn't even stop there. He says guardians shouldn't imitate cowardly or disrespectful men or even people who engage in manual labor like blacksmiths or shipbuilders. It's almost as if he wants to create a whole class of people who are completely detached from, the everyday realities of life.
So why is that? What's the logic behind all these restrictions?
Well, it all comes back to his fear of negative influence. Socrates believes that if the guardians are exposed to anything like base or shameful, even if it's in a fictional story, it might somehow taint their character.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this connects to his larger goal of creating this perfect society.
Yeah.
He wants his guardians to be these pure, almost superhuman beings that embody only the highest ideals.
Yeah.
But is that even possible?
That's the big question. And to explore it further, Socrates actually takes all of this talk of imitation and applies it directly to how stories are told. He basically divides storytelling into two main categories.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these categories. What makes them different?
The first style is what you might call pure narration. It's very straightforward. It focuses on the actions and words of good people, but there's very little imitation involved. Think of it like a factual account of events without all the bells and whistles.
I got it. So it's more like a historical record than a dramatic performance.
Exactly. And then you have the second style, which is the complete opposite. It's all about imitation. It embraces all sorts of characters and sounds and behaviors. And that includes, the negative ones that Socrates was so worried about. The overly emotional women, the subservient slaves, even the sounds of animals.
So one style is very controlled and focused, while the other is more free-flowing and diverse. Which one do you think Socrates prefers for his ideal city? Don't keep me in suspense.
You guessed it. He's all about that pure, minimally imitative style. In fact, another character in the dialogue, Adimantus, completely agrees with him, arguing that only this style should be allowed in their perfect city.
That makes sense given everything that we've talked about. But honestly, doesn't that sound a bit boring? I mean,
Right.
who wants to live in a world where all the stories are just these dry accounts of good deeds? Where's the excitement, the drama, the conflict?
You're not wrong. I mean, it definitely raises questions about what we value in storytelling. And Socrates himself actually acknowledges that the highly imitative style is way more popular and enjoyable, especially for the masses.
So why would he insist on this, like, less entertaining option for his ideal city? What's the point of sacrificing all that fun and creativity?
Well, it comes down to control and the purpose of this ideal city itself. Socrates and Adimantus believe that the perfect society needs citizens who are very specialized in their roles and morally upright. They fear that too much imitation, especially of the wrong kind, will distract people from fulfilling their duties and, staying on that straight and narrow.
Okay, I can see their reasoning even if I don't totally agree with it.
Yeah.
So does this mean that in Socrates' ideal city, there'd be no more, like, grand epics, no more plays, no more stories that really capture the full range of human experience?
That's a great question. And it leads to one of the most striking moments in this whole dialogue. Socrates uses this really powerful analogy. He imagines this wondrous wise poet, someone incredibly talented who can imitate anything. He imagines this poet coming to the ideal city. The citizens would praise him, they would recognize his skill, and they would ultimately send him away.
Wait, they banish him just because he's too good at what he does?
Exactly. His versatility, his ability to step into any role and embody any character wouldn't fit their model. They want citizens who are focused on their specific jobs and influenced only by the most virtuous examples. So it's a pretty radical idea, even for this, utopian society.
That's wild. It really makes you think about that balance between individual expression and social control, even in a system that's supposed to be perfect.
It does, and this whole discussion about storytelling doesn't end there. Socrates actually extends it to music, arguing that the style of storytelling they choose should be reflected in the kinds of music that are allowed in the city as well.
Oh, wow. So he's controlling what they listen to, too. It
Yeah.
sounds like he really believes that every little detail of their environment shapes who people become.
He does. And that leads us to some pretty big questions about whether this kind of controlled society could ever really work and whether it's even something we should want.
Yeah. I mean, this is some heavy stuff. But before we dive into those bigger questions, I think we need to take a step back and consider how all of this applies to our own lives. I mean, we might not live in Socrates' ideal city, but we're definitely surrounded by stories and influences, maybe even more so than the ancient Greeks.
That's a great point. And it's the perfect segue into the next part of our deep dive, where we shift gears from ancient Greece to the modern world.
I can't wait to unpack that. We'll be right back after a quick break. Welcome back. So we've just explored this idea from Plato's Republic that the stories we encounter and even the act of imitating characters can actually shape our own character.
Yeah.
It's a pretty radical thought. But how much of this ancient wisdom still holds up in our modern world where we're just bombarded with media and influences from every direction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, Socrates was writing over 2,000 years ago in a completely different, cultural context.
Right.
But his core concern that what we consume shapes who we become feels surprisingly relevant today, don't you think?
Totally agree. Think about how much time we spend just scrolling through social media, watching movies, listening to music, reading books.
Yeah.
It's a constant stream of information and entertainment, often with very strong personalities and viewpoints attached to them.
Sure.
It would be naive to think that all of that doesn't have some impact on how we see the world and behave.
Exactly. But the big challenge is figuring out what is the nature of that impact. It's not just a simple cause and effect situation.
Right.
Just because someone watches a violent movie doesn't mean they're going to become violent themselves.
Right.
And reading about a heroic character might inspire some people, but it won't automatically turn everyone into a saint.
So it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
But if we take Socrates seriously, even a little bit, it does make you wonder,
Uh-huh.
are we being more influenced than we realize
Yeah.
by the characters and stories that we choose to engage with?
That's a great question to ask ourselves. And I think it goes beyond just the obvious examples like violence or heroism.
Yeah.
What about the subtler things, the values, the attitudes, the beliefs that are often kind of embedded in the media we consume?
Yeah, like the way that certain shows might portray materialism as the ultimate goal.
Right.
Or how social media can sometimes make it seem like everyone else just has these perfect lives.
Exactly. It's those subtle messages that can sometimes be the most insidious because we might not even be aware that they're influencing us.
Okay, so maybe Socrates was onto something. But let's push back a little bit on his solution. Okay, he seemed pretty convinced that we should only imitate good characters and just avoid the bad ones like the plague. But isn't there value in being exposed to a range of perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. Socrates' vision of this tightly controlled society where only virtuous examples are allowed feels very idealistic.
Right.
Maybe even a bit stifling to our modern sensibilities.
It does.
Yeah.
It's like saying we should only read books with happy endings or only watch movies where the good guys always win.
Right.
That's not how the real world works.
Right. And I think you're getting at a crucial point that sheltering ourselves from those quote-unquote negative influences might actually hinder our growth and understanding of the world.
Because how can you truly appreciate the light without knowing the darkness, right? It's that contrast that gives meaning to both.
Exactly. And don't forget the importance of, critical thinking. If we're never exposed to flawed characters or questionable choices in stories, how do we learn to recognize and grapple with those things in our own lives? It's like trying to build a house without knowing anything about structural integrity.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So maybe instead of trying to eliminate all bad influences, as Socrates might suggest, the key is to develop our ability to, like, critically evaluate them.
I think so. It's about learning to discern, to question, to form our own judgments about the characters and the stories that we encounter, rather than just passively absorbing them.
It makes me think about all the debates we have today about media literacy, especially for, like, young people.
Sure.
It's not about shielding them from everything that's bad,
Right.
but it's about giving them the tools to analyze what they're seeing,
Yes.
to understand, like, the motives behind the creators, and to make those informed choices about what they consume and how they let it affect them.
That's a crucial skill, and it applies to adults as well. I mean,
Right.
we're all constantly being bombarded with messages and narratives, whether it's through advertising, the news, social media, entertainment.
So maybe that's where Socrates' ideas need a bit of an update for the 21st century.
Okay.
Instead of censoring or restricting access, as he might have preferred, maybe the answer lies in empowering ourselves to become more conscious and, like, discerning consumers of information.
I completely agree. And I think that empowerment involves a few key things. Developing those media literacy skills, cultivating critical thinking, being willing to kind of challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Because let's face it, none of us are immune to being influenced by what we see and hear.
Right.
The question is, how do we take control of that influence and make sure it's shaping us in ways that actually align with our values?
Yeah, it's a lifelong process.
It is.
And it leads to an even deeper question, one that Socrates grapples with throughout the Republic. What does it truly mean to be a good person? Not just in like a fictional ideal city,
Right.
but in the messy, complex reality of the world that we actually live in.
Ooh, that is a deep question.
Yeah.
And one that deserves its own deep dive. Luckily, that's exactly where we're headed next.
Awesome. Stay tuned. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle that big question that's been kind of lurking beneath the surface of this whole conversation.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to be a good person in today's world?
You know, it's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with, like, for centuries, right?
Right.
And I think it's even more complex today than it was back in, Socrates' time.
I agree. We talked about how Socrates believed that imitating virtuous characters was key to developing, like, moral character, but we also kind of pushed back on that idea a bit, suggesting that, maybe it's not that simple, especially in a world where we're exposed to so many different perspectives and values.
Right. Socrates was working within a very, like, a specific cultural context, and his ideal city was, it was designed to be very controlled and hierarchical.
Right.
Today, we value things like individual freedom, diversity of thought, critical thinking, all of which, complicate this whole picture of what goodness looks like. So if simply mimicking virtuous role models isn't enough,
Yeah.
how do we cultivate goodness in ourselves and in the world around us?
I think it starts with recognizing that goodness isn't just about outward actions.
Yeah.
It's also about our, like, inner motivations, our intentions,
Yeah.
and the values that actually drive our choices.
You're saying it's not enough to just do the right thing. It also matters why we do it.
Exactly. Someone might perform a seemingly good act, like donating to charity or volunteering their time, but their motivations could be driven by, like, ego, a desire for recognition, or even, a sense of guilt.
So a truly good person acts from a place of genuine compassion and a desire to, like, make a positive impact.
Yeah.
Not because they're, like, looking for something in return.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of it. True goodness comes from a place of, empathy, understanding, and a genuine concern for the well-being of others.
That makes sense, but it also sounds incredibly challenging.
Oh.
Like, how do we cultivate those qualities within ourselves, especially in a world that can often feel so self-centered and competitive?
It's definitely not easy. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection, questioning our own assumptions, being willing to challenge our own biases.
Right.
And it requires us to, like, step outside of ourselves and actually try to see the world from other people's perspectives.
It's like that saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Right.
It's about developing our, like, empathy muscles
Yeah,
and trying to understand where other people are coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
exactly. And I think that's where the exposure to different viewpoints and even, those negative examples that we discussed earlier kind of comes into play.
Because it helps us develop that, like, critical lens.
Yeah.
It allows us to see the nuances and, like, complexities of the world and to make more informed choices about what we truly believe and value.
Right. And as we encounter these different perspectives, I think we can start to identify those, like, core values that resonate most deeply with us.
Values like kindness, compassion, justice, integrity. Those become kind of like the guiding principles for our own actions and choices.
So maybe goodness in the modern world isn't about following this, like, strict set of rules or trying to imitate some perfect ideal. Maybe it's more about, like, developing our own moral compass.
Yeah.
Informed by our experiences, our values, and our, like, ongoing efforts to really understand the world around us.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that goodness isn't a static destination. It's a lifelong journey of growth, learning, and, striving to live in alignment with our deepest values.
That's inspiring, but it's also a little daunting because it means that we have to take responsibility for our own moral development. We can't just rely on someone else to tell us what's right or wrong.
That's true. And it's something we have to actively kind of work on every day. It involves making conscious choices about the media we consume, the people we surround ourselves with, and the ways we engage with the world.
It also means, being willing to admit when we've made mistakes, learning from them, and trying to do better the next time.
So it's about embracing the messiness and complexity of being human,
Yeah,
recognizing that we're all works in progress,
absolutely.
and just striving to be a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more understanding each day.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a message that really resonates, across cultures and throughout time. It's something that I think Socrates, despite his, very different worldview,
Yeah.
would probably agree with.
Well, this has been a truly amazing deep dive. We started with an ancient text about poetry and imitation, and we ended up exploring the very heart of what it means to be good in the modern world.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of these, these big questions that they can
Oh,
still challenge and inspire us, thousands of years later.
I couldn't agree more. And I hope this conversation has inspired you, our listeners, to continue pondering these questions and to, find your own path toward cultivating goodness in your own lives and in the world around you.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep those mental gears turning.